Welcome to Military Analytics. There are very important breaking moments and turning points in wars. The things that cause these moments can be a simple mistake or carelessness, an unexpected raid, or a game-changing weapon. These factors can turn into comedy or tragedy. Comedy and tragedy are two different sides of the coin. But if you're in a war, the probability of these factors turning into comedy is very low. And tragedy arises the other day with a combination of all these factors. Air resistance flared up again in Mariupol. The Russian army went through hell there as Ukrainian forces targeted Russian headquarters, military airfields, and arsenals from distances up to 300 kilometers. While this unfolded, it was a great tragedy for the Russians, but it turned into comedy for Ukraine with the 100% effective use of new British game-changing weapons. British Storm Shadow ballistic missiles have become one of the biggest game changers in the Ukrainian military. The Russian army failed to take action against the missiles that the Ukrainian army started using about a month ago. The Ukrainian army did not forgive the Russian army's mistake and inattention with its new game changer. With its sudden raids as a result of the Mariupol attacks, the Russian army lost 450 more Russian and Chechen soldiers within a week. The blows to the Russian army in Mariupol were critical in disconnecting the land corridor between Crimea and Mariupol. Let's take a look at the operational details of the Mariupol missile attack, which was a major turning point in the Ukrainian freedom struggle. As is known, Russian special forces and Marines were redeployed to Mariupol. There were also thousands of pro-Russian Chechen soldiers in the city. Over the past week, Russian soldiers have been caught in a barrage of missiles. Missiles caused explosions in the Azovstal iron and steel plant area. Huge smoke rose into the sky. Sources stated that Storm Shadow missiles were used in the attacks. The targets of the attacks were the Russian headquarters in the region. Strong explosions were also heard in the suburbs of Mariupol and near the airports last week. After these explosions, it was reported that there were attacks in the airport area. Local residents posted a series of videos featuring the powerful explosions. The explosions were so strong that the sounds of the explosions made the city groan. After the explosions, fireballs rose into the sky. Petro Andriaschenko, advisor to the mayor of Mariupol, noted that the Russian air defense was not able to repel the attacks. In addition, after the Russian bases at the Azov, Topol iron and steel factory in Mariupol were hit, another armory and military base were destroyed in the port area. The armory and military base housed Kadyrov's pro-Russian Chechen soldiers. After this week's clashes and explosions in Mariupol, Russian troops lost a total of 450 soldiers. About 250 of these soldiers were the soldiers of the Chechen leader Kadyrov. Around 200 Russian army forces were eliminated in the area of the airport and Azov-Topol steelworks. The losses in the Chechen base and arsenal in the port area exceeded 250. More than 100 Kadyrovites were destroyed in the armory area. This is a big shock for Kadyrov and the Russian generals, but neither Kadyrov nor the Russian generals explained the heavy losses because the morale of the Russian soldiers is already completely insufficient for fighting. More than 40,000 Russian soldiers were stationed in Mariupol, and it's estimated that one-third of them are Chechen. Kadyrovites Ramzan Kadyrov, a longtime ally of Vladimir Putin, sent his soldiers to the front lines from the very first days of the war. According to official data, Kadyrov sent around 12,000 Chechen soldiers to the Russian army. However, in reality, it's estimated that this number may be over 20,000. Kadyrov's Chechen troops are currently heavily stationed in the Mariupol port area and the Donetsk Passive. Chechen soldiers took part in fierce fighting to fulfill Putin's dream. However, the brutal winds of the war broke through the Chechen troops. The Chechen leader, who lost almost a battalion of soldiers last week, had also suffered serious casualties in the past months. For example, Ramzan Kadyrov's soldiers, who made serious military preparations in the city of Mariupol in February, took action to establish a support network for the Donetsk front lines. Again, however, the Ukrainian armed forces had unraveled the logistics network of the Chechen troops between Mariupol and Donetsk, thanks to the offensive operations they had previously organized. Thereupon, the Ukrainians launched a serious counterattack in order not to remove the Chechen troops from Mariupol. The infantry and artillery units of the Ukrainian armed forces, which held all the entrances and exits in Mariupol, began to infiltrate the city, which was almost 90% devastated due to heavy clashes. This infiltration operation, supported by the elite forces of the Ukrainian army, proceeded successfully without the attention of the Chechen troops, with the effect of the darkness of the night approaching the area where the ammunition depots of the Chechen troops stationed near the airport in Mariupol are located. The Ukrainians began to illuminate the darkness of the night with artillery attacks. After the artillery attacks, machine guns were activated, and an arsenal of Chechen troops near the airport in Mariupol was blown up in a short time. As a result of the attack, 2 fuel tanks and an ammunition depot at the Chechen bases in Mariupol were destroyed. The Ukrainian army, which turned Mariupol into a hell for the pro-Russian Chechen forces, managed to deal a heavy blow to Kadyrov's soldiers with their mind-blowing attacks. It seems that the only thing that passes is time itself. Mariupol is more than all and to be conquered for both Ukraine and Russia. Mariupol connects the land corridor established by the Russian army via Crimea to Donetsk and Luhansk. It is the most important part of the Azov Sea and is equipped with the most critical economic resources and logistics networks. Therefore, it's vital for Ukraine to weaken the Russian army in Mariupol in order to disconnect the Russian army from the land corridor. The determination of the Ukrainian forces did not succumb to time and increased. This situation has recently reached its peak. Although the counteroffensive of the Ukrainian armed forces has not yet begun, the official Russian army and other troops fighting for it have suffered serious casualties. On the other hand, the expected attack will be a very important test for Ukraine, which is trying to prove that it can make significant gains on the battlefield with the weapons it bought from the West. By examining hundreds of satellite images, we have identified some key points in key trenches and other fortifications built in southern Ukraine since October. These 4 locations provide insight into what Russia expects from the counterattack and what defenses Ukrainian forces may face. The first location is the western coast of Crimea, captured by Russia in 2014. Crimea was formerly known for its seaside resorts. The coastline, stretching for 25 kilometers, is now filled with defensive structures built by Russian troops instead of sun loungers and umbrellas. First, there are Dragon's Teeth along the coast. Behind them is a series of trenches that protect against incoming attacks. Several bunkers can also be seen along the trenches. Some military experts argue that because Ukraine has so little naval capability, the defenses are more of a precaution than a sign that Russia expects to defend and attack by sea. The second location is the city of Tokmak. The city of Tokmak is located in the southeast of the country on an important road that Ukrainian forces may want to use to separate Crimea from other Russian-held areas. There are reports of Ukrainian civilians being moved to turn the city into a military stronghold. This will give soldiers access to supplies and a base to retreat to. A network of trenches was dug in 2 rows to the north of Tokmak. Behind these trenches is another ring of fortifications surrounding the city. The third location is the E105 highway. A row of anti-tank trenches runs along a 35-kilometer section of the E105 main highway west of Tokmak. The E105 is strategically important, connecting the Russian-held Melitopol in the south with the Ukrainian-held northern city of Kharkiv. Along the same road is Zaporizhia, which could be the target of a Ukrainian counterattack. The side controlling the E105 can easily move the troops in the area. The final location is Rivne, north of Mariupol. The port of Mariupol is strategically located between the Russian-occupied territories in the east and Crimea in the south. Located near the small village of Rivne, about 55 kilometers north of Mariupol, each circular trench has an earthen mound in the middle, probably to protect the artillery or keep the guns stationary. Meanwhile, circular trenches allow soldiers to take cover and move artillery to aim in any direction. It shows that Russia is preparing to defend open spaces alongside wider trench networks. But some analysts point out that Ukrainian forces can detect and bypass many of these defenses using similar satellite imagery and drone surveillance. When we look at what Russia has done to strengthen its defense, we realize that President Putin is nearing the end. The fear of Ukraine's counterattacks is reflected in Vladimir Putin's defensive fortifications. At the same time, the Russian army, which continues to suffer great losses with the guerrilla warfare of the Ukrainian troops, is stuck between Putin and death. We came to the wrong home. It hurt a lot, but we didn't die. It's time to run away. We will see how long Putin can last. The Russian mercenaries on the other side of the front lines outside Barmut were about to return and were being replaced by other soldiers. When Ukrainian commanders realized that the Russians were alternately replacing Wagner mercenaries in new units with soldiers from Russia's 72nd Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, they decided to catch the other side by surprise. It was time to go. An infantry soldier who introduced himself with the call sign FACE in accordance with military protocols expressed that he felt the adrenaline. Ukrainian soldiers were told to prepare their kit, making sure they had plenty of grenades and full ammo. Brigade Commander Colonel Andriy Biletsky stated that they see the shift change as the biggest weakness of Russian forces. The morning of May 6 was the beginning of the three-day battle on the outskirts of Bakhmut, which changed the momentum in the fiercest battle of the war. Soldiers from Ukraine's 3rd Separate Assault Brigade fought the Russians in the forest belts where trees rose like burnt matchsticks. Ukrainian fighters controlled a small corner roughly the size of Central Park within the bomb city limits. They came under attack from the front and were under artillery shelling from Russian positions on the high hills surrounding the ruins. Ukrainian officials said that the only way to ease the pressure is to drive the Russians out of their positions around the city. Colonel Biletsky stated that his #1 task was to push the Russians back to Bakhmut's flanks. The colonel reported that they used 3 types of maneuvers for this. Before dawn on May 6, the unit commanders gathered and received their orders to cross a distance of about 500 meters from the Russian front lines southwest of the village of Ivaniski to the second line of defense of the Russians. This would allow them to evade the enemy's main defensive positions and force the Russians to move their positions to meet the threat. To preserve the element of surprise, the Ukrainians decided not to use artillery following the armored vehicles. The infantrymen moved quickly to protect the scorched ground as the threat of detection by Russian drones was an ever-present risk. When the Ukrainian soldiers reached the second line of trenches, the Russians realized what had happened, and an intense shelling battle ensued. The soldiers of the 3rd Assault Brigade raided the trenches filled with the dead, while the two sides opened heavy fire on each other. Ukrainian soldiers followed the armored personnel carriers in open areas. Soldiers testified that every yard gained in the blast vortex felt like a mile. But by the end of this 3-day conflict, Ukraine had reclaimed a piece of land about 2.8 miles wide and 1.5 miles deep, just south of the village of Ivaniski, outside of Barmut. Although the area seized was small, the Ukrainians have since built their success on this gain, according to the military. Ukrainian armed forces recaptured more than 20 kilometers north and south of the city. These gains represent a potential blow to the Russian war effort, making Bakhmut their primary strategic prize at their disposal. Colonel Biletsky reported that dozens of Russians were killed and more captured on the last day of the war alone. Biletsky stated that his brigade also lost soldiers within 3 days. Neither Ukraine nor Russia has made the exact casualty counts public. In addition, Colonel Biletsky dismissed the views that the Russians were inadequately equipped, calling it TikTok propaganda. The colonel stated that the Russians were ready. According to him, the Russian troops are personally well-equipped, armed, have communication means, well-armored vehicles, and a very good system of unmanned aerial vehicles. On the other hand, even as Ukrainian forces fought to retake critical areas around Barmut, Russian forces worked relentlessly for months to occupy the center of the city. The other day, the leader of the Wagner paramilitary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, claimed that his mercenaries had captured the remaining devastated blocks of the city. Yevgeny Prigozhin's allegations were quickly denied by Ukraine. Even if Prigozhin's claims are true, Ukraine's gains in the north and the south of the city indicate that the long war for Bakhmut will not end. Ukrainian and British officials have announced that Moscow is racing to bring in more troops to strengthen its lines around the city. Such redeployment could help Russia reverse Ukraine's recent gains, but it could also benefit Ukraine as it prepares for a counterattack by weakening Russian forces elsewhere along the front. No battle in war is alike. They are shaped by the contours of the terrain, the strength of opposing forces, the weapons available, the weather, and a host of other factors. The fighting outside of Ivanska, for example, offers only a small window into the fierce fighting in and around Bakhmut, which Russian forces continue to ravage within the city limits. In another development, the head of the Russian Wagner mercenary group has pledged to hand over control of the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut to the Russian army by June 1st. The founder of Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, claimed to have captured Barmut. However, Prigozhin says Kiev still controls part of the city, and Ukrainian troops are still advancing on the outskirts of Barmut. However, Prigozhin reported that his troops will begin handing over the city to the Russian army on Thursday. Prigozhin claimed that Wagner had set up defensive lines in the west of the city prior to the transfer. Analysts say Barmut is of little strategic value to Moscow, but its capture would be a symbolic victory for Russia after the longest war ever in Ukraine. According to analysts, Wagner's relentless recruitment tactics seem to have slowly eroded Kiev's resistance. There have been conflicting claims on Bakhmut's status lately from both sides. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, speaking at the G7 summit in Japan, insisted that Barmut was not completely taken over by Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin congratulated Wagner, who said he had captured the city, posing with some of his fighters. Mr. Prigozhin made this claim in a video posted on social media. A video released Sunday shows a Wagner mercenary flag hoisting on recently claimed Russian territory west of the city. In other news, Mr. Prigozhin is seen talking from a place we have determined to be close to the train station in the center of the city. Two other videos show Ukrainian forces active in the center and west of the city in areas they are fighting to reclaim. Mr. Prigozhin risked his own reputation and the reputation of his private army to take the city. Mr. Prigozhin said in his recent comments that if there are not enough personnel in the Ministry of Defense, we have thousands of generals. The capture of Barmut will bring Russia a little closer to its goal of controlling the entire Donetsk region. But when Russia fought fiercely to seize the cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk last summer, Ukraine soon recaptured chunks of land elsewhere. There was an extraordinary situation with Russian soldiers who could not withstand the power of Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian forces gave an incredible response to their operation in the city of Lyman. The Russian soldiers looked for a hole to escape, but they could not find any escape route. Ukraine's progress in ground operations was once again demonstrated by this operation. The Russian soldiers were taken by surprise and were finally forced to raise the white flag. The Russian invaders had no choice but to surrender to Ukrainian forces. Putin's failure in this operation has driven him to the point of insanity. The situation did not go as expected, and the Russian troops were helpless in the face of Ukrainian resistance. As the Ukraine-Russia war continues, Ukrainian forces have in recent days decisively repelled the Russian army from several strategic occupied territories. One of the latest victories took place in the city of Lima, which was firmly under the control of Russian forces. However, in a planned and coordinated operation, Ukrainian forces put up incredible resistance against the Russian troops in Lyman. While the Russian forces were surprised and distressed, Ukrainian forces implemented a strategic plan to gain tactical superiority over them. The Russian army faced a series of difficulties and unexpected resistance in this latest operation. Throughout the fighting element, the Russian invaders were overwhelmed by the combat skills and strategic planning of the Ukrainian forces. They found themselves in an unexpected confrontation and were powerless in the face of Ukrainian resistance. Many Russian soldiers sought escape routes, while others realized they had no choice but to surrender. Russian forces moved in for a final co-op operation with the aim of gaining complete control of the Lima region, where the occupations were most intense. The Russian army, which wanted to hold the city of Lyman and advance to other regions, lost the city of Lyman. The Russian army, which planned to organize this operation with a large contingent of military personnel, failed in the face of Ukraine's advanced technology and military power. Russian headquarters around the city of Lyman began preparations for the operation. Russian forces pressed the button for this operation to be carried out in an abandoned city in this region, where about 5 units took part. They were going to move through the city of Lyman to the nearest city where Ukrainian forces were located, and a headquarters would be established by choosing the most suitable place in this region. However, an incredible operation by the Ukrainian army did not allow these plans to be realized. Russian troops set off from the outskirts and started moving towards the abandoned city. However, direct waves with superior intelligence capabilities while on patrol realized that events were different than expected. During surveillance and reconnaissance activities, Bayraktar UAVs detected that the operation had deviated from its normal course. It became clear that Ukrainian forces were mounting an intense defense against predetermined targets. Russian troops encountered stronger resistance than expected, and their advance was hampered. The Ukrainian army, with its superior equipment and effective strategies, had a great advantage over the Russian forces. The Russian army faced an unexpected challenge in its attempted invasion of the town of Lyman. A strong and well-planned defense by Ukrainian forces surprised the Russian army and thwarted their efforts to achieve their objectives. This operation was a major turning point in the advance of Russian forces in Ukraine and would cause Russian strategists to consider their future moves by lowering its altitude. Bayraktar unmanned aerial vehicles detected the Russian forces advancing step by step towards the city of Lyman. The Bayraktars, which provided more detailed intelligence by expanding the field of view, quickly informed the Ukrainian army about this dangerous situation. When the Ukrainian army learned that the Russian forces would pass through the city, it began to make several strategic decisions. Elite military units were mobilized to create ambush points around the city of Lyman. The goal was to halt the advance of the Russian forces and neutralize them. Highly trained snipers settled on the most strategic points in abandoned buildings to observe enemy soldiers. Thanks to advanced sniper rifles and special silencers, they would work silently. The Ukrainian army sniper units knew that they were likely to face an unexpected challenge, thanks to intelligence from Bayraktar. The toughness and decisiveness shown by Russian forces in previous operations made Ukraine's ambush strategy all the more important. The snipers were meticulous in their targeting. They followed every step of the Russian troops as they advanced, waiting for the most opportune moment. According to the intelligence, Russian forces were heading towards this area in the form of about 5 units and were accompanied by many armored vehicles. Upon receiving this information, the snipers changed their plans and learnt that the assault unit in front of them had been assigned a mission as a strategic step to neutralize the armored vehicles. Ukrainian forces chose narrow city streets, planning to place remote-controlled explosives at certain points in these narrow streets. The Ukrainian forces took action as the Russian troops approached. Ukrainian snipers with superior skills prepared by positioning themselves on the most suitable buildings. After identifying the narrowest strait through which they would pass, Ukrainian forces placed a series of remote-controlled explosives along this road. The Ukrainian snipers' task was to neutralize the Russian soldiers who tried to flee when the explosives detonated. When the Russian army finally entered the city, the Ukrainian army, which had been waiting, patiently fell silent after completing its final preparations. As the Russian forces approached the Ukrainian troop positions, surprising explosions began, with many armored vehicles blown up. The Ukrainian army opened heavy fire on the Russian forces with their heavy weapons. As the streets went up in flames, the Russian army suffered heavy casualties while the Ukrainian army remained steadfast and put up a great fight against the Russian forces. Only 10 minutes after the explosions, the streets were completely silent. Ukrainian forces neutralized Russian soldiers who did not understand what they were facing as they fled into the city after the explosions. At least 4 units were eliminated by the Ukrainian army, with the aim of leaving no Russian troops in the city. To this end, the Ukrainian army dispersed into the city and made calls to the soldiers. Ukrainian soldiers came under fire from Russian forces, emphasizing that they were surrounded and would attack if they did not surrender. Taking action without any casualties, the Ukrainian army began their mission to neutralize the Russian forces. Ukrainian soldiers meticulously searched the buildings and took great care to neutralize the Russian soldiers inside. In one building, all large Russian military presence was detected. Ukrainian soldiers called on those who tried to resist the rush. Ukrainian soldiers to surrender. If they did not surrender, the building would be targeted by artillery. However, there was no response to the Ukrainian soldiers. The Ukrainian soldiers and set of explosions in every corner of the building. As a result of these explosions, Russian soldiers began to come out of the building with white flags, ignoring the orders of their commanders. Many Russian soldiers surrendered, and Ukrainian forces entered the building, ending the artillery barrage. Every floor of the building was thoroughly searched to check if there were any Russian soldiers resisting inside the building. Ukrainian troops captured many soldiers and neutralized the Russian commander who tried to resist alone. Putin's operation, which resulted in casualties, made him appear to be on the verge of madness. According to Ukrainian media, Russian forces in the town of Lyman have been completely pushed back. But Russian news channels are still hiding the truth from their people. The great success of the Ukrainian forces has been hailed around the world. Putin's failed attempts continue. The interrogation of the Russian soldiers captured during the operation revealed big secrets about the Russian army. Facts such as the fact that the commanders of the soldiers used violence, that there was a serious food shortage, and that no attention was paid to health problems came to light. This information and images were reflected in the world press, and all countries took action. There are calls for Putin to stop from everywhere, but Putin responds only with nuclear threats. The end of Putin, who never thinks about the future of his country, seems to be approaching. Thanks you for watching us.